Hello, welcome to the new Stack Makers, where we talk about at-scale application development, deployment, and management. Thank you for joining us. It's PagerDuty Summit here in San Francisco. It's muggy, but to me, let me tell you, it's beautiful. It's always beautiful for me here at the Embarcadero. We're at Pier 27, covering the events here at PagerDuty Summit. The theme here is Ops Reimagined. Notice I didn't say DevOps Reimagined, but Ops as in short for Operations Reimagined. How are we streamlining operations processes to make it possible for development teams and operation teams to collaborate and deliver better value to the customers? This edition of the new Stack Makers is sponsored by PagerDuty, maker of the Digital Operations Management Platform. DOM combines incident management with machine learning and advanced analytics to empower operations teams to respond to their networks and their applications before things go wrong. Download the 2017 State of Digital Operations Report now and see how IT operations teams stack up against the expectations of their customers at PagerDuty, PagerDuty.com. Continuing our coverage of PagerDuty Summit in San Francisco at Pier 27 at the Embarcadero. I'm Scott Fulton here with my new Stack colleague TC Curry. I promised everybody we would talk about service mesh architecture and we would get into something fairly technical, and I absolutely can deliver now. We've delivered Matt Klein, software engineer from Lyft, who will talk something more about Envoy, open source project that effectively puts a proxy beside a number of services. And TC, you've covered this in text in the new Stack here recently, have you?
I have. Matt has done two different presentations that I've been present for at the serverless conferences, one in January where you were talking about how to move from monolith to microservices, and then more recently last month the conversation was how, as kind of a step-by-step, how did I deploy Envoy into this. And as Scott said, Envoy is a service mesh, which is, sidecar basically to your stack. And essentially, this is really, really high level, essentially you attach the sidecar gathers information as it sort of swoops along on its regular path, and it ends up giving you amazing visibility, load balancing capabilities, and the ability to see things in the stack that you otherwise could not have seen. Is that fair?
That's perfect.
That, and it's a beautiful sidecar with a big bell on the side and lots of old-timey architecture.
Racing stripes.
Racing stripes. There we go.
It's all good.
No, yeah, that's perfect. I mean, I like to talk about it where people today, they're typically deploying their services in 5 or 6 or 7 different languages. It's very common today where people have Java and C++, but they have Go and Node and Python, and they have all these different services, and it's very difficult to actually get consistent behavior between all of these things, because what you're asking people to do is you're asking people to build libraries in every language that they actually support to do things like load balancing and stats and logging and tracing, and then you're asking them to actually deploy their application every time you update this library, so it's super painful. So the idea behind the sidecar is that you can implement all of this complicated stuff once, and you can do it in a high performance way, and then you can deploy it alongside everyone's application, no matter what language it's written in or what service framework it's written in. Yeah.
So versions of library updates happen once.
Yeah, right. So we at Lyft, we deploy Envoy across the entire infrastructure, typically twice a week, which is pretty incredible when you think that we have hundreds of services. And if I wanted to deploy Envoy across the entire infrastructure in 3 minutes, I could do that. That's not wise. I don't recommend that anyone does that, but we could, and that's because because it's its own process. I can go along, I can deploy everything across the entire infrastructure, basically in a very fast amount of time. So, whereas if it was a library, we support 3 or 4 different languages at Lyft. So I'd have to update the library, write it in 4 different languages, and then I have to go ask and beg and plead every service owner to deploy that application and rebuild and relink their program and then deploy it, which might take months.
Go right ahead.
I'm sorry. What's exciting to me about this is that Lyft has a monolith.
It does.
And it's adding microservices to the monolith. And so I think the ability for other companies that are leaving monoliths in place but adding serverless architecture and APIs and microservices and all of that, as they're deploying that, you can put Lyft on top of it and you get visibility into your monolith but also the microservices. And that just seems so useful.
Yeah, I think we come to conferences and you have people that we as a group we're in this tech bubble where we talk a lot about kind of the newest shiny thing that everyone should be using, but the reality in technology for almost every company is that you have years and years and years of code and systems that you're trying to bring along into things that are more modern. Right. So no one has the capability to replace everything that they did before and miraculously go to this new, microservice service mesh system. I mean, everyone goes on this journey.
Right.
So, I actually think what we've done at Lyft is very instructive because we're like most companies, and in fact, I would not counsel any new company to start with a complicated kind of microservice architecture because it's complexity that you just don't need. So I think starting with a monolith is great, and we, kind of as technical leaders have to help people transition, from that monolithic architecture to that service-based architecture.
Right. It's interesting that you should use the phrase complexity that you don't need.
Sure.
Are you legitimately saying that there are aspects of microservices architecture that, when compared with the value that companies are already delivering with the monoliths they already have, the justification isn't there for a complete move to microservices architecture ever?
I think it's a case-by-case basis, but that's basically exactly what I'm saying. I think that, again, we as an industry, we look at kind of the shiniest tech that's out there. And there's a reason that when you look at Twitter and Facebook and Google and Microsoft, that these companies have built extremely complicated technology. It's because that they run at a scale with both people and traffic, where in order to actually make that work, you have to build more and more complex things. Complex, and then to make it simpler for people. I think a lot of times we have startups and smaller companies where they see these things that some of the bigger companies are doing, and they assume, well, we should just do it because they're doing it. But you have to look at the total picture, the total cost of ownership, right? And I think that it's a complicated equation where, in general, I'm very pragmatic. I think people should only, kind of take the complexity that they need, and if they can get by with less complexity, that's what they should do. So I think that as companies evolve, you end up, and you grow, if you grow, you end up taking on more complex systems. And complex is a weird word because it sounds bad, but I mean that you take on kind of more feature-rich systems that might be harder to run, but ultimately it makes you run faster.
Right, so it's a need of scale.
Exactly.
I mean, when microservices become useful is when the scale has gotten so big that the sheer volume of data is slowing down your...
Yeah, I would say it's actually not just sheer volume of data.
Okay.
It's also number of people. So what you'll find, from a development process perspective, and there's people out there who are going to say, well, Facebook used a monolith until just 3 months ago or whatever. I don't actually know when they stopped, but companies can make these things scale for a long time. But what most companies find is that as the number of people people grow, just the mechanics of trying to do commits into a giant code base and deploy it and like get that deploy out before more commits come in and break things and deal with CI and testing and all of that stuff, it's really hard. And doing that decoupling that microservices gives you makes people scale better. So it's people and data. But like I said, full transparency, there are companies that have made monoliths scale through Herculean tooling efforts,
right?
You know, to a very large level.
Right.
Now, when folks talk about the delivery of legacy services and old-style monoliths, they don't typically think of a company like Lyft. I mean, there are individuals who are just now getting used to the fact that, oh yeah, that's right, Lyft is the one without the umlaut. So what was Lyft's excuse for having a monolith in the first place? How did it get there? Why didn't they just start on the Adrian Cockcroft road and just dive right into microservices?
Because of what I was just saying, it's just for a startup, it's complexity that's not needed. It's just if you have 5 developers, you put them in one code base, you put them behind one database and one load balancer, and they code features and they deploy it.
Okay,
it's just simpler.
So maybe our characterization of this is incorrect. Maybe if what you're saying is true across the board, then a lot of these startups are actually proliferating the architecture that we call legacy, that we use the 2001 phrase monolith to try to describe here, as if it's some type of really old world service with a hand crank someplace here.
No.
When really it's the startups that utilize this architecture because it's the simplest way to go.
So, you know, there are people out there who will be upset to hear me say this, but I think that, you know, there's different kinds of startups. There's startups building services like Lyft,
right.
But then there's a lot of other startups building technologies to sell to startups like Lyft, right? And you don't sell a monolith. Like, there's not that much to sell there. I mean, you can have monitoring and you can do a bunch of stuff, but there's a lot of startup energy being devoted towards making kind of service mesh or microservice architectures actually work better for people. And that's important because as companies scale, like, they do need to solve these problems. And I'm not saying that these startups are doing bad things, like, they're doing great things. But, you know, we work in a place where people want to sell. There's a bunch of marketing, and I think you're right. Like, I think monolith has a bad name, but I would argue that for any startup, if you're 5 people and you're not doing a monolith, you're probably not doing the right thing. I mean, that you're not using the resources that you have most efficiently to get your product out the door.
So for all those startups who are joining us on the live stream today, tell us about the virtues of monolithic architecture. Where do you start if you want to produce a monolith and do it in record time?
Are you asking me?
Yes.
Or,
The fellow sitting behind you.
No, I wasn't sure if you were going to like open this up to comments or something. I think that, you know, I think that for most startups, again, for me personally, I complain a lot about services that are written in languages like Python or Node or other languages, because ultimately, in the long run, they don't scale very well for a large variety of reasons. But for a startup, take your people are going to laugh, but, you know, take your PHP or your Go or your Python or your Node and crank out your product and use a database, whether that be MongoDB or Dynamo or something else, and just make it work. Right. I mean, because from a startup perspective, it's much more important, from my perspective, that you get something, you know, in front of customers and vet it to see if it's worthwhile and interesting. And then if it's interesting, well, yeah, then you have to start building for the future. But I think that there's companies that end up, you know, they think too far ahead for the infrastructure that they might need eventually, when most startups are going to fail. That's just the reality. So build fast, you know, and then be able to pivot.
Yeah, and to answer your question, there's a lot of companies moving in to make this really simple, like DigitalOcean. You can spin up servers and databases, and it's a 2-minute process, and bam, you're ready to go. And it's secure, server, and they've got load balancing, and they've got enterprise level, so it's not that hard. And when you were talking about the monoliths that have scaled, it's possible, but it just takes so many people. I mean, when I was at Oracle Open World last year, they spun the cloud up, but they hired 14,000 developers to do it into a year and a half or 2 years.
That's a lot.
That's a lot of resources that most people don't have.
Yeah.
Good high-paying American.
Yeah. So, to your point, it's easy to get into. Actually.
I mean, once companies have to scale, and by scale I mean either data volume or number of employees.
Right.
There's a lot of different ways to do it. The reality is it takes a lot of effort, and it's like whether you scale your monolith by having extremely flexible and rich deployment mechanisms, and like how you do rollbacks and roll forward, and how you do branching and all of that, or you get people doing microservices, but then you have to handle all the networking, all of the observability, all of that stuff. I do think it's true that most people are moving towards the microservice architecture versus the scale the monolith architecture, but they're both doable. It just takes people to go and make it happen.
So here's a question. Can Envoy then, if I'm spinning up, my DigitalOcean environment, can I add the Envoy service mesh to that?
You could. I mean, I think the larger that your architecture is in terms of number of services, the more benefit that it has.
Right.
But one of the things that I like to talk about during my talks is even a monolith is actually a distributed architecture, right? Like people sometimes don't see it, but even in a monolith, you have a load balancer, you have some horizontal scaling of your monolith, and you have some database. Right. So there's already two or three network hops there. So you already have some distribution going on and some networking. So having, better load balancers, or even a sidecar next to your monolith that can actually go out and give you stats and tracing and logging can be very beneficial for debugging. Okay. So I would say that no, you don't have to have a massive microservice architecture to actually make it worthwhile. It's probably more worthwhile.
So I'm interested in sort of moving a little bit into what's next for Envoy.
Sure.
It's interesting to me because your last talk that I heard, you were saying that I'm working with this company Istio, and we're putting together some interesting stuff. And then I went to an Istio meetup in San Francisco a couple weeks ago, and they've built a whole company in which Envoy is a very integral part.
Remind us who Istio is.
Istio is a brand new company.
It's a open source project.
Open source project.
Yeah,
okay.
not company.
It's not an actual company.
It's kind of a consortium between Google and IBM and Red Hat and like a bunch of other companies who are getting together to develop this.
So Starfleet, you're saying?
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
The Starfleet of service mesh architecture. So it was interesting to me, and so I wanted to ask you, it's like, how do you get Google and IBM to work with Lyft, and where does Lyft come into that picture?
Well, yeah, I mean, so we open sourced Envoy almost exactly 1 year ago. I think it'll be 1 year, maybe next week, and the growth in the last year has been absolutely crazy. It's been just insane. And we obviously have been working with a lot of different companies. We've been working with Google and IBM on Project Istio, but we actually have a lot of other people that are using it also. There's other systems that are getting built on top, and we're actually starting to get fairly wide deployment across other companies who are starting to look at this as a kind of proxy system. Mm-hmm. And we could go into a huge amount of detail, but there's a bunch of different proxies out there today. Obviously, there's Linkerd in the service mesh space. We have Nginx, HA Proxy, Traffic. Obviously, there's a lot of load balancers from the cloud providers. We have F5 and Cisco and other companies. So it's an area of very active development. And I think one of the things, there's a couple of reasons why I think Envoy has become so popular. But one of the reasons that I think is it's kind of this universal universal data plane. And by that, I mean that we expose these APIs. So we allow people to actually build different control planes that are specific to their business.
Okay.
And then they can kind of use Envoy, and it's very configurable, it's very extensible, and people like that a lot. And I think what you're going to see moving forward, we're actually, it will be probably officially announced next week, but we are going into CNCF, so that'll be exciting. I'm not sure when the official
this news is completely unofficial.
Right,
You didn't
yes.
hear it from us first.
Unofficial.
They're launching in CNCF.
The voting is still ongoing, I think. But yeah, it'll likely go through, and we'll be officially announcing next week. And there's a lot of synergy between Kubernetes and like a bunch of the tracing stuff and logging, and there's just lots of things that are happening right now. And I think that I never would have thought this kind of when we open sourced a year ago, but I think that now kind of Envoy is the tech to beat in this space. So I think it's going to see very wide deployment, and I'm super excited and super humbled by all of this. It's crazy.
What you've said about the role that Envoy plays, you'd find some agreement in the necessity space from that well-known purveyor of sort of monolithic infrastructure that has pervaded our life and lifestyle, Microsoft. Microsoft produces today a just-in-time compiler, which is open sourced under .NET Core. That just-in-time compiler is made for containers. The idea, from how it's been explained to me, is that you can take essentially any language, and you, with the same technology that you were using to create these behemoth monoliths of the past, you can use C#, F#, languages that might not be as big in the open source space today yet, but they could still be. To take some of the architectures from 10, 15 years ago, and suddenly, bam, with very little or any changes, you're building microservices, and then you're building a way for services to connect with one another using APIs. So, given that, what is the difference between what .NET Core is doing and what Envoy is doing?
Well, that's a deep question. Well, first I would say that Microsoft of today is not the Microsoft of 10 years ago. I worked at Microsoft actually to start my career from I think 2003 through 2007, and Microsoft today is all about open source. I mean, they're getting into Kubernetes, like you can run Linux apps now on Windows, so they're actually embracing all these technologies in a super large way. I think that what you were just talking about in Envoy, they're things that would work together. They're not actually the same. They're not actually competitive. And in fact, Microsoft is porting Envoy to Windows. So that work is just getting started. So I think ultimately you're likely to see Envoy running in Azure in some way. That'll happen eventually.
Something else you didn't hear from us first.
So I think where all of these technologies are going is, people are moving towards a container-based kind of infrastructure where they want their applications to be kind of bundled together and to be runnable, but they still have to be they have to be networked, right? So, even if you take your just-in-time compiler and you compile these languages into something that runs, you still have to talk to each other. So, to me, what you were just talking about is a way of efficiently kind of creating runnable packages for applications, which sounds pretty awesome, but then you have these containers with binaries in them and you still have to have them talk to each other.
But a runnable package for an application, that's a definition of monolith, isn't it?
Well, it's a definition of a thing that runs. If it's the only thing that runs, it's a monolith. But if you run three of them, well, now it's a microservice architecture.
Now it's a trio.
Right. Yeah. So yeah, I mean, I think that's pretty neat, and I think the technologies are probably complementary.
Okay.
Yeah.
I wanted to point something out that I found fascinating. Also, you built Envoy with a team of 4 people, right?
Less. I mean, most of it in the beginning, it was actually just me, and then a coworker came, and it was 2 of us, and then 3 and 4, and yes,
Right.
very, very, very small number. Yeah.
So for the people out there saying, what can one person do, or what can like a really small team do? You can do a lot.
Yes, you can. I think people often underestimate what is possible. Yeah.
So it is an open source project. How can people get involved with Envoy?
We are really trying to make the project accessible. So, we have obviously a lot of issues that people can work on. We have active communities from mailing lists to Gitter to all the normal stuff that people do. We would love people to come, even if it's helping with documentation or helping with tutorials or helping with examples. If you want to code features, we have features to code. So I would invite anyone that's interested to check out our documentation and check out the repo, and just, people are pretty nice. We would love to get people involved.
And also, I know that Istio is holding meetups, at least in San Francisco and Seattle,
Yep.
possibly other places.
Yeah, I think actually we're going to do a combined meetup in October in Seattle. I don't have the date right now. That'll be, I think I'll give a talk, and there'll be someone from Istio who'll give a talk too.
Right. So there's lots of ways to get involved and to find out what's going on.
Matt Klein, software engineer with Lyft.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us, for being a part of this.
Thank you.
Thank you.
TC, thank you for being a part of us as well. I always appreciate having you and your insight here.
Thank you.
And more forthcoming from Pier 27. If I don't keep decrementing it, it will become Pier 14 by the time I'm through with it. Pier 27 at the Embarcadero in San Francisco. I'm Scott Fulton. You've been listening to the New Stack Makers, sponsored today by PagerDuty. Learn how the PagerDuty Foundation supports community programs such as technology career coaching and talent recruitment at pagerduty.org. Listen to more episodes of the New Stack Makers at thenewstack.io/podcasts. And take a moment, please, rate and review us on iTunes, and like us and follow us on YouTube. Thank you for listening. We'll see you next time.